Welcome to Valor and Virtue. I'm Jim Danielson. Today we are very pleased to have with us Colonel Gerald Hurst, United States Air Force retired. The Colonel has quite a story to tell, and we are very grateful to have you here to talk about it. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and about your military service?
Well, thank you. I appreciate, excuse me, the honor of being here. And first off, I'm a native of Onslow County. I grew up here during the Great Depression of the 30s and went to Jacksonville High School. Later, went to North Carolina State. Got a degree in mechanical engineering, and at the same time, got a commission in the United States Air Force, courtesy of ROTC. So the education that I got between Jacksonville, which was kind of simple, and what I got at North Carolina State served me well in the military. I entered the U.S. Air Force in September of 1956, and I was fortunate to qualify to go to pilot training. So I spent a year at two different bases getting my wings, and after about 253 hours of training in three different airplanes, I became a qualified pilot. By virtue of my class standing, I had first choice of assignments, so I selected a squadron that had F-102 jet fighters in Southern California. And after going through 5 weeks of interceptor school where I flew the F-86, I went to George Air Force Base in Southern California and flew the F-102. After about a year, we got the F-106. Both of these airplanes were made by Convair. And the F-106 was pretty amazing because it came in the inventory in 1958. And it was a Mach 2 airplane, meaning that it flew faster than 1,500 miles per hour. The remarkable thing, it had barely been 10 years since Chuck Yeager had busted the sound barrier at Mach 1. And in those 10 years, we had progressed from breaking the so-called unpenetrable sound barrier to being able to exceed 1,500 miles per hour. The F-106 set in 1958 set a speed record of 1,526.96 miles per hour.
Wow.
That record still stands today for a single-engine jet fighter.
Let me ask, when you were flying, how fast did you go?
Well, the Mach 2 speed was an advantage when you intercepted a high-altitude threat. The Air Defense Command flying the interceptors, which the 102 and the 106 were designed to intercept an invading bomber force attacking the United States. To do that, the airplanes had a radar and a fire control system and missiles and rockets. The F-102 carried 4 air-to-air missiles. It also carried a 1.5 kiloton atomic rocket.
Wow.
That rocket was 8.5 feet long and carried a wallop which would destroy anything within a mile circumference of having been detonated. Thank goodness we never had to use it.
Yes.
But so after about 3 years in the 329th Fighter Squadron at George, I was assigned to Misawa Air Base, Japan, back flying the F-102s. And the F-102 carried 4 missiles plus 2.75 rockets. So our mission there was to protect northern Japan. And repeatedly we would intercept Russian bombers that penetrated the Japanese air defense identification zone. And they would just kind of come in and dare us. We would intercept, take pictures with a telephoto camera, and then they would scoot back to where they came from.
Did you ever go to Keflavik, Iceland?
No. My air defense assignment was at Misawa. I was there 3 years, and incidentally, on one scramble mission, we intercepted a Neptune P-2V Navy plane that had run out of fuel for its reciprocating engines, was barely making it with the little jet engines on the wing. And he couldn't get altitude to get across to Sapporo or Chitose in the island of Hokkaido. So at some point he said, I'm going to have to ditch. So we helped him ditch, and it was pretty amazing. He hit the water and skipped once and then settled, and there were 13 orange flying suits and 2 rubber rafts out immediately. They thought it was going to sink, but it didn't. It kept floating.
Really?
And they had to be towed to shore and guarded, and then later I think the Navy went up and got it, took it out, and I think it had a lot of high-level intelligence gathering equipment on board. So anyway, returning from Japan, I went to McChord Air Force Base in Washington State, back flying the F-106. And there our mission was to go to Alaska and pull alert at either King Salmon or Galena or Eielson up at Fairbanks. So, and there we would routinely intercept the Russian bombers that would come across from Siberia or wherever and penetrate the northern Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone. So it's kind of interesting because on a mission, a scramble mission, early morning, I think it was 1967, I was first out of the hangar, Red 1 call sign. I had wingman Red 2. And climbing out, the controller said, your target is 12 o'clock range, 600 miles, 43,000 feet. During the climb, the controller came up and said, Red 1, be advised you are instructed to destroy this target. Believe me, I sat up straight because we had routinely intercepted these bombers. So we carried top secret authenticators. So I pulled out the authenticator and said, authenticate Kilo Alpha. And he came back with the right authentication. So I knew it was a valid order. So I'm sitting there. And so I advised Red 2 that we had a valid order, reached over and broke the safety wire on the armament switch, and I got ready to do a lethal mission. So climbing out, I crossed Point Barrow. This target was 150 miles north of Point Barrow, out over the Arctic Ocean. Nothing but ice as far as you could see. So trust me, you look at the engine estimates very closely when there's nothing but ice. So about 10 miles or so past Point Barrow, I say target information. So target Angels 43,000. 12 o'clock, target speed 70. I said, 70? This must be a hell of a headwind. So then I heard this snicker. He says, Red One, be advised, target is a balloon. So I tell you, if I could have reached him, I would have cold cocked him. But
So you didn't shoot at it?
So I told Red One, I said, go through your checklist. We're going to shoot down a balloon. So I locked on with the radar. The fire control did all the computation, gave you a steering dot. All you had to do was, when the steering got down to 20 seconds, you pull the trigger, the doors would open, the missile rack would come down. So I selected 2 radar missiles. And as the target squeezed down, pulled the trigger, the 2 missiles went away. They missed. This was a huge balloon, and it had what I would estimate a 10 or a 12-foot white package at the bottom. But the missile was bracketed, didn't go off, so I told Red 2, arm up and have at it. He said, I don't have you. I said, do you have the target? He says, no. I said, orbit your present position. So I came back around south, turned around and put the sun behind me. We had an infrared device for detecting the target. So I got a nice spike on the scope, locked on in IR and cross-moded to radar. I know this is all technical stuff, but when I locked on the radar, it gave range information to the fire control. So again, X appeared, pulled the trigger, missile, 2 went away. Nothing. I said, damn, how will I ever explain this? So as I flew by the balloon, I rolled up on the wing and looked. The whole backside was coming apart. The missiles had gone through the bag, and the detonation required breaking the wire in the leading edge of the missile's fins.
Which didn't happen.
But it went through, and down went the balloon. So I said, thank goodness I don't have to explain 2 misses. So
did you ever get a story on the balloon?
There was I should have brought it, but I have a news item from the Alaskan paper that tells about us shooting down the balloon, and the Air Force claimed it was a weather balloon. But I've always maintained that the location and the jet stream contours, that it probably came from Siberia, northern Russia, or somewhere. So unlike our recent episode with a balloon where it was allowed to take its mission all the way across the United States, this one was destroyed and now rests at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. So regardless of whether it was Russian or ours, doesn't really matter.
Right.
But the good thing is I didn't start World War III. But so after about 3 years or so at McCord, I knew that I was coming up for an assignment to Vietnam. So I didn't want to take pot luck. I didn't want to fly helicopters. I didn't want to fly bug smashers. I didn't want to fly even the F-4 because you had a full-time backseat guy. I liked to be by myself. So anyway, I got in an airplane, flew to headquarters, checked with the big sergeant that had the spreadsheet. He says, Major, you're about 2 months out. We've got you down for F-4s. I said, can I select? He said, you can try. I said, I'd like to fly the F-105. So he picked up his pen and scratched through F-4 and put down 105. He says, you've got it.
Wow.
What I didn't realize was that the F-105 was taking the lion's share of casualties. During the 9 years or so that the F-105 operated, there were 156 F-105 pilots that died.
Wow.
So it was not really a good place. But I always said that the P-51 was the airplane to fly for a fighter pilot in World War II. In Korea, it was the F-86F that had the tangles with the MiGs. And I figured that the glamour airplane in Vietnam was the F-105. So I left McCord in '69, went to Wichita, trained in the F-105 for 4 or 5 months, and then I was assigned to Tak Lee Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. All of the 105s flew out of either Tak Lee or Korat in Thailand. So I was there about 2 days. I flew a local orientation flight, and on the third day I was on my first combat mission. So I don't know if anyone listening to this has ever been into combat, but trust me, you have a little bit of anxiety. So our typical mission would be as a flight of 2 or a flight of 4. And we would take off from Tak Lee, join up, find a KC-135 tanker about 100 miles north, get on the boom, top off the fuel tanks, then turn east as a flight and go to the assigned target. So on my first mission, after I got off of the tanker, I took time to say a 1-sentence prayer. Dear God, please be with me. I repeated that little prayer on all of my subsequent 91 missions. So not to be, Bible-toting or anything, but trust me, I felt better. And I went on to fly 91 missions. On mission number 38, I can't remember, maybe I forgot my prayer, but I got hit. And coming off the target, the third pass, immediately the engine oil pressure light came on. And I looked at the oil pressure gauge, and it was slowly making its way to 0. I knew that we were in trouble. That day I was flying a 2-seat Model F-105. I had an electronic warfare officer in the back seat named Clive Bevan. He was a captain, a navigator by education, but he managed a lot of electronic stuff to sense and ward off the surface-to-air missiles that came out of North Vietnam. So I told Clive, even before the oil pressure light came off, I said, Clive, we have another mission, Maeve, if this bastard doesn't fall out of the sky. I swear, it wasn't 10 seconds later that the light came on. I was still in afterburner, zigzagging to avoid the fire, and here the oil pressure was failing. So the procedure there is to set the power and don't touch the throttle and don't put any G's on the airplane. Hopefully you can preserve the oil film on the journal. And so fortunately, well, typically I'll say this, a jet engine might run for 15 or 30 seconds, maybe a minute with no oil. This engine ran for 6 minutes.
Wow.
So I was able to get out of the bad guys' country. And I almost made it to Udorn, which was a northern base. But about 50 miles out, I had to descend. So when I started down from 23,000, I had to slow down. So when I pulled the throttle back and popped the speed brakes, the airplane vibrates, and immediately the engine seized. And of course, you're still pumping fuel into the burner cans. So my wingman was flying close formation and watching, and he advised me that I was streaking, and then he says, "You're on fire." So about the same time, I had a red warning light. So I had told Clive to be prepared that we might have to eject. So I said, Clive, when I tell you I want you to eject, I pulled the nose up. When the airspeed I was doing close to 500 knots. When it got 250 knots, I said, Clive, eject. He didn't go. I said, Clive, eject. Still didn't go. The third time I put some anti-religious words in front of that, and he went. So then I took the position, pulled the ejection lever, nothing happened. So I immediately looked down, and as soon as I looked down, the seat blew. I had forgotten there was a 1.7 second delay between the two seats to prevent entanglement. So my head slapped down on my knee. I don't know why I didn't break my neck or my back, but I went out of the airplane like this. I can still see the wings and the cockpit going away. So the chute that we normally had been pulled 2 days before because of a problem, and we had an older chute. And for some reason, this one, even though it was supposed to open automatically, didn't. So after 4 or 5 seconds, I said, damn. So I grabbed the D-ring, pulled the ripcord, and deployed the chute. So coming down, it was not a good area. I thought I was going to go into a tree, and then there was a fence. So I'm trying to slip the chute, and you're not supposed to look at the ground. You're supposed to, anyway, I broke my ankle.
Oh.
And when my head snapped down, the chin strap went into my voice box, and I couldn't talk for a week and a half. So anyway, I got on the ground, and the parachute had a signal device that sent out a signal that the helicopters could home in on, and you could actually hear it. It made a doo, doo, doo sound. So that told other people that you had a chute that opened, you know. And so within, I guess, 15 minutes, there was a chopper above, and another chopper picked up Clive and picked me up. And so I spent 2 weeks in the hospital with an ankle and my throat. So anyway, interesting story. I called the squadron and told them to send me some study books that I had. And when they sent that, there were about 10 little bottles of booze. So there was a sergeant in the bed next to me who had gotten hit by a grenade in the back of his leg. And he says, Major, he says, what are you going to do with all those little bottles? I said, well, I'm going to have one, but I'm not really big on the booze. He says, well, if you'll just pass them over. So one by one, I tossed them over. And next thing, he was ringing for the nurse to bring a Coke. So that was my good deed. So anyway, I went on to, let me say this, there's nothing heroic about ejecting or bailing out of an airplane. I mean, it's saving your fanny. And in the process, I was in danger and Clive was in danger, and I lost a $7 million airplane. So it was my bad luck. But again, it was nothing heroic. So I went on to fly 53 more missions after I had 9 weeks of on the ground getting my leg back in shape. So when we left Tockley, they had decided to close the base. So we flew the F-105s back across the pond to Nellis Air Force Base. And from that assignment, I went to Langley Air Force Base, back to the F-106. And I was there for 2 or 3 years, and then I received a command assignment. So I finished out my career. Oh, while I was at Langley, I made lieutenant colonel, and that got me into a higher assignment. So from there, I went into an assignment at Hurlburt Field, Florida. I was there for 3 or 4 years, and while I was there, I made 06. And Hurlburt Field, Florida was Eglin Auxiliary Number 9, and is often thought of as the base that Jimmy Doolittle trained at for the Tokyo raid. And so Eglin is a huge base, and it's got a range out in the Gulf. So it was a good assignment for me. From there, I moved to Kelly Field with the Headquarters Security Service, which is the branch of the Air Force that has listening bases around the world, picking up intelligence via radio and other signals and so on. And from there, I moved up to Bergstrom Air Force Base, again in a command position. And in 1982, I retired after 26 years. So looking back, I had a very good career doing what I really enjoyed, which was flying airplanes and flying some really beautiful, beautiful equipment.
Did you pass on the F-4 because there's a backseat guy?
Mostly, I just thought it was an ugly airplane.
Did you really?
It wasn't very attractive, but I passed up 2 opportunities to fly the F-4. The first one was when the squadron at Misawa, Japan was deactivated. And for me to come back with the squadron required me to extend for 6 months. and I didn't particularly want to extend for 6 months. Plus, I was like a junior captain, and at that time, in a lot of cases, you would end up in the back seat.
Oh.
And I didn't want to be in the back seat. So I refused to extend for the 6 months. And they extended me 3 months anyway. But looking back, the 4th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Massawa was one of the better assignments. It was remote, and there was only a mile of paved street outside of the base. There was nowhere to go, so there was a lot of officer club parties, and everybody had camaraderie. And years later, we had reunions every 2 or 3 years, and even today we have a lot of people that keep in touch. So it was a good assignment.
Well, that was 26 years, did you say? Yes. So you kind of covered the treetops, I guess. It was absolutely fascinating. Can we talk a bit about your family and presence here as people in Onslow County and your history with the Marine Corps?
Well, I go back to the 30s, having been born in 1933. I was roughly 8 years old when the government took over the property that became Camp Lejeune. My father was born on a farm that is now considered Hadnot Point or Paradise Point at Camp Lejeune. He stayed on the farm until he was, I think, 26 years old. He helped put 3 of his siblings through college. He was kind of the leader of the family. And but he married my mother, I think, in 1931. She was born and raised at what you know as Courthouse Bay. The farmhouse was about 300 or 400 feet up from the stoplight at Courthouse Bay, which back then was known as Marines. Had nothing to do with the Marine Corps. It was named for a family named Marine. And so they were farming folks. My mother picked cotton. My father raised tobacco and corn. They hunted and fished, and it was back then. Onslow County was an agrarian place. Farms, people earning their living from growing crops. There were businesses. Jacksonville in 1940 had a population of 973. If I hadn't have been here, it would have been 972. So anyway, and I can remember when there was only one street that was paved, and Johnson Boulevard was a dirt street. And so about 1931, when my father and mother were married, he moved to Jacksonville and took a job as a mechanic downtown. He was always very mechanically inclined. And after 3 or 4 months, the city fathers asked him to be chief of police. At that time, there was only one other officer, I believe. Anyway, he became chief of police. I think one other officer. And he was to hold that job for 19 years, from 31 to 1949, all through World War II, when the base came and Jacksonville became a boom town. And there were people from all walks of life, the good, the bad, the otherwise, that congregated here. as a result of the military buildup. So I grew up going to the movies downtown and watching the westerns and Tarzan of the Apes, and I was allowed to have a free run of the town. There was no fear of, the stuff that you hear of in New York City and San Francisco and other places today. So I grew up camping and fishing on the river. From an early age, I had a boat with a motor, and I had a free run of New River all the way to the inlet and had campsites. My buddies and I probably camped every weekend until we discovered girls, and then there was a different emphasis. But during the war, it was an interesting time because you had this huge influx of people and people training. So the bad part was that by eminent domain, the government invaded Onslow County and appropriated 111 or more acres of beautiful property to create Camp Lejeune. And what a lot of people don't realize is that this all began well before the declaration of World War II. In fact, 750 families were evicted from the property that became Camp Lejeune. 750 families, about 2,500 people were evicted, their livelihood uprooted, and the compensation was meager. There was no money for the actual move. They got paid for the property or the farm buildings, the homes, the businesses, but not a penny for the actual move. So it caused a great deal of bitterness. I have seen letters where some of my relatives wrote the government speaking of the unfairness and asking for more compensation, which never came. There was one case where a gentleman applied for more money. They sent him a $60 check, and they reportedly that he tore it up and threw it away. So, but back then, again, people had to be off of the property by September the 1st, 1941, a couple of months before the declaration of war, the raid at Pearl Harbor. So the U.S. was already building up on a war footing. There was a draft. Services were being built up. There were airplanes on the assembly line. Thank goodness, by 1941, the B-25, a very nice bomber, was available for Jimmy Doolittle for the Tokyo raid, which was a huge morale booster when we attacked the country of Japan only 4 or 5 months after they had bombed Pearl Harbor. So I just finished reading a book on Jimmy Doolittle. He was a giant of a person. He only stood 5'4", but he was a giant. He went on to do really great things for our country, served on different boards, commissions, and so on.
Did he fly off of an aircraft carrier?
Yes. At the end of April 41, 16 B-25s took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet, and they had programmed to take off about 400 miles from the coast of Japan. And the fuel, the extra fuel they had on board the B-25 was just enough to get them to China. And they were supposed to get there and land at a certain Chinese base. But the Armada, which included the escort vessels, and the aircraft carrier Hornet, was detected 650 miles shy of Japan. And these picket boats had radios. So the picket boat had sent a signal to Japan saying that there's U.S. vessels approaching Japan. So out of the fear of the raid being detected and intercepted, they decided to launch early. The seas were like 20 or 30 feet, deck up and down, but they had practiced and timed the takeoff so that when the bow was coming up, the B-25, which was taken off in like 500 feet with a full load of fuel and 1,000 pounds of bombs and incendiary bombs. So all 16 got off the carrier and successfully navigated to Japan and split off and attacked their different targets at Kobe and Nagasaki and Tokyo, and I can't remember the other. And they were deliberate in attacking only military targets. They did not attack hospitals, although the Japanese came later and claimed that they had hit schools and stuff like that. That wasn't true. And they continued to fly to China. One aircraft decided to go to Vladivostok in Russia, and they were interred for the rest of the war. Russia did not enter World War II against the Japanese until the last few days of the war. And so the one crew made it to Russia. The rest landed in China. Sadly, there were a couple of crews that were captured after they got to China. And the Japanese, being barbaric, executed, I think, 3 of them, which was an atrocity, to say the least. The Japanese were beyond cruel in World War II. Their bonsai thought process said that you did not surrender. You either died or you committed hara-kiri, suicide. And so they looked down on anyone that was a surrendered type of person. So all the prison camps, the famous Bataan Death March, all of those events were the product of the Japanese being just beyond cruel. So the Doolittle raid, while it did not do a lot of damage, it did some damage, but not a lot of damage, was a great morale booster for the U.S. at a time we badly needed some morale boosting.
Now, I've read about that, though. Perhaps you would know that along with that, the raid sort of alerted the Japanese that they were vulnerable.
Yes. It caused them to divert troops to protect the homeland and assets and airplanes and what have you to be dedicated out of fear that we were going to do that again.
Well, as we wrap up, it's been fascinating, by the way. This is terrific. Have you said as much as you would like to say about the land and Camp Lejeune?
Well, I will say that, excuse me, several years ago, a committee was formed, and they were able to raise funds and finance a marker which was installed in the Beirut Memorial area.
Really?
If you park in the parking lot and walk about 200 feet on the right, there is a granite marker which lists all the surnames of the people who were evicted from Camp Lejeune property. My mother's last name was Covil, C-O-V-I-L. My father's last name was Hurst, H-U-R-S-T. They are listed along with the many other names that there's also an engraved and etched map of the property, and the road leading to my grandfather Hurst's farm was called Hurst Road. So just a little bit of history. But of all the patriotic things that were done was to sacrifice the property. And Onslow County was not the only place. Property at Cherry Point was appropriated, other places around the nation. And we should not forget that the Japanese in San Francisco and Oakland were hauled off to what amounted to a concentration camp for the duration of the war. They lost their property and were never really compensated, to my knowledge. And least known were the fact that German people, places like New York where there were German immigrants and so on, they likewise were installed in certain areas and out of fear that they would be secret agents. That was really not true, because if you recall, in the Pacific, there were Japanese Americans who served in the service, and they fought valiantly. And I'm sure there were some Germans. So there were other things that went on. For instance, many people don't realize that at Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a shipyard, and this shipyard had 7 ways. A way is a place where you lay the keel and you build the ship. They had 7 ways. They turned out 6 Liberty ships a week. A Liberty ship was a cargo ship about 600 feet in length. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist, had set up this shipyard, and they would build the bow section, the center section, the engine, the stern section. These huge gantries would take them over to the way, and they would be welded together. 6 a week would roll down and be launched.
Wow.
And 18,500 workers, 3 shifts a day, 8 hours each. Welders and sheet metal workers and machinists. In Dayton, Ohio, the Ford plant was converted to build B-24s. A B-24 rolled off of that assembly line every 30 or 45 minutes. A complete flyable B-24. The same thing was done with the B-17s, P-51s, P-38s. It's amazing the industrial might that generated starting in 1940 to support the war effort. It just boggles your mind. Can you imagine the hundreds of thousands of parts, the gauges, the wires,
Yeah.
the engines, the tires? And then there was Rosie the riveter, these ladies that learned to do the work on the assembly line. It's mind-boggling, the sheer, something like 12,000 B-17s. And another interesting, the 8th Air Force in Europe started flying missions in 1942, B-17s, later B-24s. They would send out a raid of like 600 bombers. A third of those bombers would not come back, shot down by the fighters or ack-ack, flak. And that took a heavy toll. The 8th Air Force lost more people in those years, I think, combined, than all the other casualties. Later, they were able to equip the P-51s, the P-38s, P-47s with drop tanks to extend the range. So they had escort all the way to Berlin. But prior to that, there was a very deadly toll that was taken. Each one of those bombers had 10 crew, gunners, navigator, pilot, co-pilot, radio, you name it, bombardier. There were, beyond your imagination, the heroic effort that it took for a crew to realize that yesterday in their quarters there was a person, another pilot, another co-pilot, and now they're not here. And yet they crawled in the airplane and flew another mission. So a lot of heroics. So God bless them.
Yes, God bless them. Colonel Gerald Hurst, this has been fascinating. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, sir.
I hope that in some fashion that some of our youth or people that are growing up can appreciate maybe this and what other people have done with this video series.
We hope that too. We want Americans to understand that there's something to this country that is very good and worth defending and worth loving, and not just criticizing, although that has its place.
We need a revival.
I'm with you. I'm with you there.
Well, I thank you very much, and thank you, General, for your monitoring, and I thank everyone for watching this little story.